Welcome to Foreign Countries, Conversations in Archaeology with me, Ash Lenton. Hi, and welcome to this special episode on osteoarchaeology, violence and trauma. Today I'll be speaking to three guests about their groundbreaking research across a number of different periods in the European past. Later on I'll be joined by Angela Boyle to talk about violence in society in early medieval Scotland, and then by ELINAHLINSUNDMAN, whose recent paper on concepts of masculinity and violence examine weapons-related sharp force trauma in later medieval Iceland. But first of all, Dr. Linda Fiebiger of the University of Edinburgh is here to talk about prehistoric violence and her experiments relating to sharp and blunt force trauma injuries in the European Neolithic and Bronze Age. So welcome, Linda. As a way to set the background, can I ask you about your paper in Human Reflections? It was cleverly titled The Past as a Foreign Country and was a response to Steven Pinker's book The Better Angels of Our Nature.
So the background to this research really is my own long-term involvement in research on violence and conflict in prehistory, and this has become more of a topic, I think, in the last couple of decades, and a lot more work on it has come out: archaeological work, bioarchaeological work, and Pinker's volume caused quite a lot of public discussion about the origins of violence and also the scale of violence, especially in prehistory, which with his rather linear view of the development of violence from a very deep time violent past to a more peaceful present. So what I try to do in my article is really reflect on his use of both archaeological and bioarchaeological evidence and his failure to properly contextualize the figure he was using, and also the lack of reflection on the experiential context of violence, how people actually experience violence in prehistory.
So how has violence in prehistory been thought about previously?
I think the first thing to recognize is, even with all the archaeological and bioarchaeological evidence, the further you go back in time, the further removed you get from your own day-to-day experience. So I think you have to tread very carefully when you try to make inferences on people's behaviors, people's thought processes. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I mean, this is what archaeology does. It's trying to reconstruct past lifeways, but it does so very much evidence-based in the first place, and then it's trying to build on that evidence-based scaffolding. It's trying to develop more extensive theories on people's thought processes, lifeways, how it felt to be living in that particular time. But from looking at that from your present day perspective, you're very far removed from it. Secondly, what I would point out is it's always very dangerous to have a linear, almost evolutionary view of the past and how we came from one point in the past to where we are now in the present. And history and archaeology, they aren't linear, they're cyclical. If anything, just like the past wasn't always violent, it wasn't always peaceful, that's the same today. So in a sense, there's shared experiences, and I think they're probably more important in a way than the differences. That's the basis that makes it possible to understand past human behavior and life experience, because some of these are not so very different from what we experience now at a personal level. Violence and conflict would have been as horrendous for people in the past as they are in the present. It's just how that was defined in the past, that's a different question. You know, what people viewed as violence or as conflict or as war, they might have defined that differently for themselves, but the ultimate human experience would have been very similar.
And what has recent research led us to now?
Research and views on violence in prehistory have really been transformed through both archaeological and bioarchaeological work in the last couple of decades. If we go all the way back to the 90s, there was very much a widespread sense that the Neolithic was this golden dawn age for humanity, happy farmers tending to their animals and crops. Sheep may safely graze, that's always a term I'd like to use. But then cracks, in a sense, started to appear, and people started to look at this in more detail, and also with some bioarchaeological evidence. For example, the Mars grave from Thalheim in southern Germany, dating to the earliest part of the Neolithic in the area, clearly showed that violence did occur and affected all sections of society: men, women, children. So initially there were two camps, those who saw prehistory as very peaceful, and then another camp emerging as it actually was brutish, violent, etc. But now, going into the new millennium, we saw a lot more structured, large-scale surveys, especially of skeletal evidence, because the skeletal remains provide the primary evidence for conflict. Yes, you can look at fortifications, you can look at weapons if they exist, but they're always secondary to the injuries you can recognize on the skeleton. So with these larger dedicated studies looking for violent injuries on skeletal remains, we now have a much better idea of the scale of potentially violent interaction in this period across a large area. And I'm here at the moment mostly talking about Central and Western Europe. So we now have a handle on the what, and now we really want to know about the how and why. And this is where this experimental study comes in.
Right, so let's talk about that experimental work and your antiquity paper on violence in the Neolithic. What kind of questions can you pose about violence in the past?
So we now have all this recorded evidence of injuries on skeletons in the Neolithic. So that's good. And a lot of them are what we term blunt force trauma. So caused by a blunt implement, or I'm trying to avoid the term weapon because it's a whole topic in itself. Usually we talk about weapon tools for the area, especially for Western Europe. We don't really have implements that can be clearly defined as weapons in the period. They're multi-purpose implements or weapon tools. So a lot of blunt force trauma, but we don't really know what kind of implements in particular cause these injuries. And there's obviously a huge difference whether, for example, I use a club to injure somebody because I have to step in quite close to hit them, or whether I use something like, for example, a sling stone where I'm multiple meters away and try to injure somebody. So there's questions about strategy and which way people engaged in violent interactions in the past. And beyond that, we can also maybe think about intent, the severity of the injury, whether injuries were intended to maim or stun or to kill. There's also quite a different kind of thought process and strategy and intention behind that, because essentially during the period we have small-scale societies that were probably reasonably well connected locally and beyond. People were trading, marrying. So we have to think about how people negotiated their day-to-day relationships and how violence fitted into this network of small-scale settlements.
And you do that by reconstructing trauma scenarios.
If we look at forensic investigations of injuries, they quite frequently try to reconstruct injuries by replicating them in an artificial manner. And this is done using, most of the time, some sort of bone stand-in, like a substitute. I mean, depending on where you operate on this planet, in some countries, you can use cadavers for research. But in the current European context, that's not usually done. So you're looking for a substitute material to represent the bony skeleton. That's the approach we took. People have used animal cadavers for this in the past, but they're very different anatomically and skeletally from humans. So that isn't a very satisfying way to go about it. Most recently, people have used artificial bone material, and what we used is a material called SimBone, and it's been used most in ballistic testing. So what we wanted to do is see how it would function in this more blunt force related setting. So what you do is this material comes in either spheres, which represent the cranial vault, like the top part of the head, or it comes in cylinders, which act more like long bones, and they do come in different thicknesses. And basically, any impact on that results in fracturing looks very much like it would look on the bony skeleton. For us in particular, we were interested in injuries to the head. My own research on violence in the Neolithic has been focusing on the head for both practical and other reasons. A lot of the remains, depending on which area you're looking at, they come from collective burial monuments. So to individualize the remains within it, looking at the head is the easiest way to go about it. But there's also another reason. The head is very much a focus for violence. This is the same today. Was probably the same in the past for both practically and psychological reasons. If you want to injure or stun somebody, aiming for the head is a good bet to be successful. So we take these sym bone spheres, this artificial bone material, we fill them with ballistic gelatin to mimic the brain tissue. And then, for lack of a better way to put it, you whack them with whatever implement you're interested in to see what kind of fracture patterns they cause.
And what implement did you use?
One very particular implement. So this is a wooden implement. It's been named the Thames Club, found near Chelsea, and it's very unusual to have organic materials from this particular time period in Britain. I mean, in a sense, naming the period the Stone Age is a bit of a misnomer. We should probably name it the Pottery Age, the Wood Age, the Organic Age. Organic materials were really important, but we don't usually find them unless there's very particular wet contexts where wood, for example, can survive well. It has been discussed whether this was a weapon or a tool. It's been suggested it was a flax beater to process plant fibers. But if you look at it, it looks a bit like a paddle, or people have likened it to a cricket bat. But certainly if you pick it up, and we made a replica for experiments, the original is in the Museum of London and very fragile, so you can't use that. But if you pick up the replica, you do want to swing it. So we tried to see how this particular implement would work as a weapon. And we basically whacked these spheres with this club.
And how would you use the Thames beater as a weapon?
Well, there was two strikes. One was an overhead strike, so holding the long handle and bringing it down with the flat. And then another strike was using the pommel to actually strike the sphere, to incorporate two ways of handling this particular implement. I suppose the same way, if you want to go closer to our period, people have used swords at times. Obviously, most of the time you use the blade. But if you have swung the blade in a backward motion, you can use the pommel as a weapon as well. So in a sense, that was very much the idea. Use it, swing it, and use the inverted commas blade part to hit the sphere, or you can use the pommel.
I would imagine that the blunt force trauma could be quite severe.
The pommel strikes didn't cause as much damage, so clearly you get more force with the wider swing, looking at the physics of force transmission and strength, etc. That makes sense. So if we use the blade, inverted commas blade part, that caused quite extensive damage to these spheres. The initial impact damage, so that's your primary fracture, and then you have other fractures radiating out from that in a star pattern. That's your secondary fractures. And then also in a circumferential pattern around the initial impact, so tertiary fractures. So it's quite extensive, potentially catastrophic damage, always depending, of course, also how much force you put behind your swing. But in the experimental context, we got the person who did the hitting to do it as hard as possible. It's probably interesting to add that there's two schools of thinking when it comes to experimental work. One is to, and this is what we went for, to, in a sense, make it more actualistic, more like a real life scenario, make it as realistic and as natural in terms of, as comfortable, if that makes sense, for the person to swing the club, do it whatever way feels right for them to get maximum force. So this actualistic approach is one way to do it. The other is to make it as replicable as possible. And then you really have to go to a laboratory and use more engineering type equipment where you control the force applied each time, the exact position of the sphere in relation to the club, etc. So that means it's more replicable, but it probably doesn't tell you as much about the actual experience on the ground that somebody had when carrying out these activities.
Yeah, as someone who fights with swords, I can see the advantages of using the personal approach rather than the mechanical one. But what kind of results did you get from this?
Unsurprisingly, swinging hard wooden club at a breakable object causes a lot of damage. So that wasn't the surprising feature. What we were really interested in was the pattern of the damage. We did a couple of repeats, so we didn't just use it on one sphere, we had multiple spheres. I still remember when we did this, this was one of the first experimental bioarchaeology projects that I was involved in. And I arrived looking at this and going, I've seen this fracture pattern before, exactly this fracture pattern. Basically, the type of damage we produced was an exact match for an archaeological case from Neolithic Austria from a site called Aspern-Schletz, which is another, like Thalheim, another mass fatality site. So a high number of individuals buried, dispersed in this ditch, partly articulated, partly disarticulated, a lot of injuries, and there was a cranium, part of the head of an individual at Aspern, which showed exactly the same fracture pattern as that which we produced through our experimental work. So what does that mean? It basically means that an implement like the TEMS beta could produce these type of injuries, and an implement like that might have been used at Aspern-Schletz. So that's the first time now we can connect a particular implement weapon tool to the Neolithic skeletal record. That was a really exciting finding. I should qualify this by saying that does not mean that the club or whatever was used to cause the injury at Aspern looked exactly like the TEMS beta. Okay, bone can only react in certain ways, so there will be overlap between different implements or weapons and the fracture patterns they cause. But it's still very important because for the first time it allows us to talk about specifics rather than just using this broad term blunt force. We can talk about more specific implements and also think about what that means about the violent events that took place that led to these people being deposited in this ditch at Aspern-Schletz.
And presumably that opens up a whole new set of questions about prehistoric weapons and violence.
It certainly does, simply because it opens up the possibility of maybe creating this database through our experimental work of potential injury patterns caused by particular weapon classes and go beyond just sharp force, blunt force, projectile trauma, and look at each of these categories in much more detail. People have started to do that for later periods, for example, in the Middle Ages and beyond, where you obviously have a lot more documentary evidence on particular weapons and the injuries they cause, and people have matched particular weapons to particular injuries. But that hadn't really been done so much in prehistory, and it hadn't really been done for blunt force weapons. So people have done that much more for sharp force implements, and then obviously going into the modern period for guns. So this is quite an exciting avenue to pursue because the experimental setup is fairly straightforward and also reasonably affordable, which is another consideration if you want to carry out research, and also if you want other people to build on what you've done and carry out their own projects.
In the Journal of Archaeological Science paper, it seems a lot more natural to talk about weaponry when we get to the Bronze Age.
In terms of the archaeological background, the Bronze Age has always been seen as a period that involved a certain level of violence and conflict, unlike the research history for the Neolithic, simply because you now have bladed weapons and they're quite evident and widespread in the archaeological record. And what you also have is violence and conflict emerging within a specialized group of society. There's this image of the warrior, so violence becomes something that's specialized and something that is associated with a certain profession. So in a sense, that's a different research history. And again, dominated in the archaeological record by sharp force implements. Swords, of course, but also axes and daggers or dirks, smaller bladed weapons. What we were interested in our own research was the effectiveness of these different weapons and compare them to each other and see whether we can distinguish them in terms of the skeletal trauma they cause, because a lot of previous experimental work has really looked at how particular weapons were used. So a lot of experimental work on how particular swords were being held. People have published on this, and they've often used animal cadavers because they weren't so much interested in the marks the weapon leaves on whatever they're slashing or stabbing, but how the weapon would function and what kind of damage would be caused to the weapon if you use it a particular way. So we wanted to turn that around and look at the marks particular weapons leave on the bone.
You've posed more questions there about sharp force trauma. How did you go about answering those?
So again, we use SimBone as our experimental material. And I suppose the secondary question was, because SimBone had been used in ballistics testing, we'd now successfully used it for investigating blunt force trauma. And we wanted to get an idea how useful it would be to investigate sharp force trauma. So 2 questions: the effectiveness of the weapons, what kind of marks they leave on the skeleton, and then in terms of SimBone, how effective SimBone would be. And so the setup was similar to that for the blunt force trauma studies. But in this case, we used both the spheres to simulate the human head, but we also used SimBone cylinders, which are a stand-in for the long bones of the skeletons. And then again, we used different implements: Wilburton type sword, an axe, a flanged axe, and a dirk that were produced to replicate the weapons of the period. We use them to hit or stab or slash our artificial bone material.
And what did you learn using these sharp weapons?
The main result really was that the injuries caused, or the marks caused by the sword and the axe, were quite distinct. Morphologically, they were easily distinguishable. But the main problem was distinguishing between the dirk and the sword. So the sword wasn't really that different from the knife class weapons. And that also probably leads to questions about how these particular swords were used. They're a lot shorter and thinner than, most people, when they think of a sword, they probably think of a medieval, massive, fairly heavy bladed, long bladed weapon, whereas the Wilburton sword is much shorter and the blade is much thinner than those much later swords. So the sword and the knife, it was very difficult to distinguish them, both macroscopically and microscopically. A secondary result was that even though the macroscopic traces that these weapons left on the SimBone, it looked good macroscopically, so it did react like bone would, but more close-up, more microscopic features, they didn't appear on the SimBone as they would on the human skeleton. Usually if you use a blade and it hits human bone, it leaves these very fine striations on the surface of the bone, and you don't get that with SimBone. There are certain limitations for looking at sharp force trauma.
So how did the range of injuries compare with the blunt implement?
The main thing to state is, in terms of their ability to cause damage to the skeleton, that has been established through these experiments. Though it should be kept in mind that, the intention would probably not have been primarily to cause damage to the skeleton, but cause damage to the soft tissue. And with sharp force weapons, especially, probably they're most likely aimed at different parts of the body than, for example, the Thames club would have been. It makes sense to hit somebody over the head with the club. With the sharp force weapon, you're probably more likely to aim for the torso, for example, for vital organs. You might not even nick a bone, but you've caused a fatal injury. So that's something to keep in mind. But we definitely established that they would have functioned as weapons that could have caused skeletal damage as well. So there's no doubt about that. The other important outcome is that for experimental studies, probably SimBone isn't the best stand-in if you're looking at skeletal damage, if you're looking for sharp force weapons. And then secondary result, which wasn't so much related to the skeletal damage, but to the weapons themselves. In the first round of experiments, when we used the dirk, the handle actually broke, and it broke in the area of the rivets, the little studs that hold the handle in place. our work was in conjunction with another PhD student's work, Rachel Faulkner-Jones, who was more interested in the functioning of the dirk and how people used it. And she was super excited. This dirk broke, and we're like, oh my God, what have we done? And she looked at the break and said, this is so exciting, because most of the ones we see in museums, like archaeological examples, this is where they break. So now we know in what kind of context that probably would have happened. And so this is more related to how the weapon would have been used, and maybe how it shouldn't have been used if you want to preserve it for future use. So that was quite exciting as well.
And how does this open up future research into prehistoric violence?
So my own research has now moved chronologically into the Bronze Age. So I'm currently involved in a project called The Fall of 1200 BC, where we're looking at what happened in the later part of the Bronze Age, collapse of a lot of the big Bronze Age civilizations, population displacement and movement, etc., with a particular focus on evidence for violence. So there's been a chronological shift, and we're hoping to do some experimental work as well, again, related to particular cases where we have particular damage to the skeleton and can't quite figure out what caused it. So we're hoping to set up more symbol experiments and trying to think of potential weapons for particular injuries and see whether we can verify that experimentally. But another aspect of violence in prehistory I've been quite interested in, which I've developed further, is the use of slingshot in Neolithic Europe. You do get slingshot evidence for the Neolithic of Southeast Europe, where you find air-dried clay slingshot projectiles. And slingshots are blunt force projectiles compared to arrows, for example, that tend to pierce and are more sharp force projectiles. So we do get evidence for them in Southeast Europe, but we don't get them for the Central and Western European Neolithic. And I believe they would have been used. Why would they have not been used? And slings are actually a very democratic weapon, if you want to put it like that. Having been doing some work with people who know how to sling, I didn't expect this before. And it's actually fairly easy to learn the basics, how to use a sling, how to get a projectile off in the right direction. And with a bit of practice, anybody can do it, men, women, children. Indeed, slings are still used today in parts of the world for recreational purposes. There's a big competition in the Balearic Islands every year. They're also still used for hunting in some parts of the world. So I was very interested in developing that aspect. And because we don't find the slings themselves, they're organic, they don't survive. And we haven't found any big caches of slingshot from the Neolithic in Central and Western Europe. I was thinking maybe we can go about it the other way. Maybe we can identify what kind of injuries slings cause, and then go back to the archaeological record and see whether we can find any of that.
And how do you do those experiments?
So I've started with some initial experiments with a collaborator from Germany, somebody who's been slinging since childhood. We set up an initial round of experiments where we used simple stones and a similar experimental setup. We had symbol spheres, which we this time mounted on a tripod at person height, and he hit them with a sling. This isn't published yet, but we had some very exciting results from that. I think there's a lot of potential, and other people are working on that as well, to, as I said, almost trying to establish this library of experimentally produced injuries that people can go back to and say, okay, I have a particular injury on my skeleton. Do I have evidence for these implements or weapons in my particular area, in my particular period? And what does it mean for the violent interaction taking place?
Thank you, Linda. Thanks for talking to me. I'm joined now by Angela Boyle, who has been a consultant osteoarchaeologist in the UK for many years. Angela has produced a major synthesis of the osteoarchaeology of southern Scotland for her PhD thesis. We're going to talk through that now and its consequences for the understanding of early medieval violence in northern Britain. So welcome, Ange. We're talking specifically about conflict and violent behaviour. What was the landscape to the north of Hadrian's Wall in the early medieval period?
The focus of the research is the early medieval period, broadly speaking AD 400 to 800 in southeast Scotland. I'm interested in trauma. I have a long-standing interest in the skeletal evidence for violence, so that's what I wanted to focus on. The reason that I picked southeast Scotland is because it's quite a distinctive part of the country, because it's bounded to the north by the Antonine Wall and to the south by Hadrian's Wall. So that gives the inhabitants of that area quite a distinct identity in comparison to the Romanised natives in the south and barbarians to the north. There's a lot of archaeological evidence which suggests that the Romans and the native Votadini had what could be described as a mutually beneficial relationship, and that the situation between them was relatively peaceful. I wanted to think about what happened after in southeast Scotland. From AD 400 on, the southeast experienced a number of very significant events. We had the end of Roman rule, the arrival of the Anglians, and the commencement of Viking attacks. Now, the traditional view of the historical sources is that the Anglo-Saxon occupation invasion was akin to Hollywood cowboys and Indians, which is how I came up with the title of my thesis, and that they operated basically a process of ethnic cleansing. So I wanted to think about how can the study of the human remains from this area shed any light on whether or not that's actually what was happening. As I was scoping my research, I very quickly found out that there were no regional syntheses of human remains in southeast Scotland for the period, and pretty much across Scotland, if you exclude Orkney, there's quite a bias to the prehistoric material in Orkney, but a huge gap in the skeletal data for the study area. A lot of the material was excavated in the 19th and early 20th century. Much of that had never been osteologically analysed. Further material, which was excavated more recently in the 20th century, underwent osteological analysis, but the field of trauma studies is so rapidly advancing and techniques are improving all the time that I thought it would be beneficial to actually attempt to apply those new techniques to the material. So it was a combination of completely new analysis of a percentage of the assemblage and reanalysis of material that was excavated later in the 20th century. I also wanted to take advantage of the biomolecular techniques that we can apply now. Obviously, they weren't around in the 19th and earlier 20th century. So I've tried to combine full skeletal analysis using the most up-to-date techniques with DNA analysis, isotope analysis, and new radiocarbon dates to put all that together, basically all those strands of evidence, which broadly speaking is a bioarchaeological approach. It's an attempt to draw in as many strands of evidence as possible to attempt to answer the question that you're posing. So in a nutshell, I wanted to determine by looking at the skeletal material whether the early medieval period in southeast Scotland was conflict-ridden or not.
This is a highly multidisciplinary approach, but what was your main focus and where did that take you?
I examined more than 300 skeletons from a total of 35 sites across the study group. I carried out complete osteological analysis of each of those skeletons in accordance with the national standards. So a full record of every skeleton in the study group exists, although my main focus was on trauma, and particularly non-accidental trauma. Now, you do get studies where cranial trauma is the focus for all sorts of reasons, often because it's disarticulated assemblages. In this case, I had 300 plus discrete skeletons to analyse. So we've got a full record of all of that data. As I said, there have been huge advances in the study of trauma in skeletal material in recent years, much of which was not available back in the day. So I felt that it was important to apply all of that, and that has been hugely beneficial, as we will discuss. I was also keen to take advantage of improving biomolecular analyses, so strontium and oxygen isotope analysis, some DNA analysis, which kind of fed into other ongoing projects around the country. We also carried out a little pilot study which involved SEM and XRF analysis of the cut edges of some injuries, basically to see if we could find any trace of the weapons that were used. Unfortunately, this wasn't successful, but we're looking at trying to try that again. We only attempted 2 samples to do that. I also looked at mode of burial of all of the individuals, the assumption being that if victims of violence were buried in a standard manner, they were probably buried by other members of their group. If they were buried in an unusual or non-normative manner, then perhaps they were buried by their assailants. The artefactual evidence for weaponry in Scotland is meagre, to say the least. A handful of artefacts. However, there is a huge corpus of iconography on carved Pictish stones, which are just outside of the study area. They depict the use of weaponry, swords, spears, knives, axes, clubs. That was used to complement the meagre artefactual record. In addition, you see occasional combat scenes and even battle scenes. The intention was to bring all of these different strands of evidence together to attempt to answer the question of whether or not violence was endemic and people were fighting all of the time, as the historical sources tend to suggest.
And what about reanalysis of older material?
In addition to the evolving techniques for DNA analysis and for isotope analysis, it's now possible to acquire radiocarbon dates using very, very small samples of human bone. And where possible, I have attempted to supplement older radiocarbon dates with these newer radiocarbon dates, which have a far tighter date range.
But the trauma, the physical trauma, is the starting point, yeah?
The most direct evidence for violence in the past and indeed in the present is the marks that are left on human remains. So I see these as the basic building block in any study of violence in the past, with all of these other strands being complementary and adding to that basic picture that's provided by the human remains.
So what is the evidence for violent behaviour in the archaeological record?
As I already said, there was an absence of any regional synthesis for the human remains in the study area prior to my work. There was a general perception that skeletal evidence for violence in Scotland before the 9th century was apparently absent, although this observation was not based on data from a population-based osteological study. Rather, it was based on kind of anecdotal evidence from a variety of different older publications. As I said, I analysed over 300 skeletons. I identified 27 skeletons with cranial trauma from 10 sites, which provides a true prevalence rate of almost 12%. Now, some of those are isolated examples, but the majority come from 4 sites, which are located in and around the Firth of Forth.
Can you talk me through those 4 sites?
London Links on the north shore of the Forth, the Isle of May in the Forth, and Cramond, which is on the south shore of the Forth. The 4th concentration is at Dunbar, which is a little further down the coast. Dunbar is interesting for the period because it was a native stronghold which almost certainly became an Anglian royal centre later in the period. Now, this prevalence rate is significantly higher than other contemporary sites from around the country, with the caveat, however, that prevalence rates for regional studies, whether it's in Scotland or elsewhere in the UK, for interpersonal violence, they're difficult to come by. Usually you'll only get data on a single cemetery or for unusual sites such as battles, massacres, mass graves, that kind of thing, which is not directly comparable to what I was doing. A publication back in 2000 which attempted to present an overview of all of the osteological data in England came up with a prevalence rate of only 2.6% for weapon injuries across England. So clearly this high number at nearly 12% is of huge significance.
Yeah, it seems that way. Who are the victims?
85% of the victims were male, just over 11% were female, and there was a single neonate or newborn. There were slightly more males than females in the group as a whole, the study group as a whole, although non-adults were very much underrepresented, but the predominance of males was slight, was not statistically significant.
Right, so what can you say about the injuries?
Most cranial injuries that I've identified are on the right side of the head. This could suggest attack from the front by a left-handed assailant or from the back by a right-handed assailant. I would suggest that it's perhaps more suggestive of a surprise attack, because it's generally agreed that injuries to the left side of the skull are caused by a fairly formal style of fighting, in other words, face-to-face with a right-handed opponent.
And the majority were in this localised area in southeast Scotland?
My 4 concentrations were in and around the Firth of Forth. Most interesting and perhaps unusual of these is Cramond, which was a Roman fort. A deposit of material that had been excavated in the 1970s had been misidentified as medieval. It comprised 9 adults and a minimum of 5 neonates who had been put into a Roman latrine. A recent radiocarbon dating programme proved that these were in fact late 6th to early 7th century, which obviously fits in very well with my period of research. 5 men and 4 women had been placed in a variety of positions, one on top of another, and also in a variety of orientations. Now, this is unusual because the normal method of burial at this point would have been in a west-east orientation in a supine extended position.
And what happened to these people?
Several of these individuals demonstrated evidence for fatal cranial trauma. There was a young adult woman who had suffered a massive blunt force blow to the right side of her head. This may have been caused by the butt of a spear, although it's absolutely impossible to do more than suggest likely weapons or indeed tools that were used to inflict such violence. Interestingly, one of the neonates demonstrated a very, very similar injury in precisely the same location. There are also 2 adult males who exhibit evidence for cranial shaft force trauma, which again would have been fatal. In one case, the top of the skull had been completely bisected.
So what was their story?
These injuries, the concentration of injuries, the manner in which they had been buried, suggests that they all met a very violent end and they were potentially buried by their assailants, hence the non-normative manner in which they were deposited. Now, preliminary DNA analysis has confirmed local ancestry of all of the individuals, and it further suggests that the adults were not close relatives and that they belonged to different maternal lineages. As I say, those results are preliminary, so we're hoping to find out a bit more about that. At the moment, I would suggest that Cramond presents more questions than answers, really, because the burial appears to have happened over a short period in the late 6th or early 7th century, but definitely in 2 phases. First phase, 5 burials. Second phase, 4 burials, all the adults. We haven't been able to work out how the newborns fit into this sequence because the excavation happened a long time ago and the infants weren't properly identified at the time. So what possible sequence of events could have accounted for this? Were local inhabitants unlucky enough to be ambushed and killed by assailants on 2 separate occasions? Were the attackers Anglian incomers from the south or Picts coming from the north?
Does this fit with the historical narratives at all?
The historian Bede mentioned a royal stronghold called Judeo in his Historia Ecclesiastica, which was held by the Anglians at the beginning of the 7th century. Now, we don't know exactly where Judeo was located, but it must have been important because both British and Gaelic names for the Firth of Forth are derived from it. Cramond has been put forward as one of those possible locations for Judeo. Bede further refers to it as an urbs, which suggests that subsequent to it being a native stronghold. It was then occupied by Anglians.
And are the other locations similar?
London Links is located on the north shore of the Firth of Forth. Discoveries of human remains have been recorded since the 19th century and through into the 20th. The main focus of work at London Links happened in the 1960s when the main bulk of the cemetery was revealed during a storm. The cemetery is Pictish. It's believed to be of some status because the majority of the long kists are associated with quite elaborate cairns of different types. The material was osteologically analysed in the 1960s, but they didn't look at the 19th century material. I incorporated that into the work that I was doing. Now, one of the 19th century discoveries is, in fact, a young man that has been decapitated.
Decapitated how?
The location of the injuries on the skull, on the occipital condyles, right at the base of the skull, suggests that his head was removed by a blow from behind. His head must have been, indeed his neck, hyperextended in order for this to happen, assuming that he was alive at the time. It's likely that a sword was used to carry this out. It would have taken at least two assailants, one to wield the sword and one to hold the man in position in order for that to happen. Was this a formal execution? The use of a sword is quite a symbolically charged decision to make. It could have been a high-profile and quite public event. Unfortunately, because this skull was discovered in the 19th century, only the skull was retained. That was common practice. Ideally, I would have liked to have been able to examine the entire skeleton, but that's no longer possible. I'm hoping to get some radiocarbon dates on this particular example.
Were you surprised to find a decapitation?
Now, decapitation is not common in Northern Britain in the period, in spite of the quite considerable concentration of decapitations in Southern Britain during the period. What we do have, however, are depictions of decapitations on the carved stones that I mentioned earlier.
And what about sharp force trauma itself? Was that rare?
A second example of fatal sharp force trauma from London Links was excavated during the 1960s, but was not identified as such. It was only identified during my research. In fact, another researcher who was looking at dental pathology saw it first and flagged it up to me. This prime adult, 25 to 35, had suffered multiple fatal sharp-bladed injuries to the back of his head, which had removed a large portion of the skull. So much of the skull had been removed and was no longer associated with the skull that it was not possible to sequence those injuries, but at least 3, if not 5, blows to the back of the head, all inflicted with massive force, either from above or behind by an assailant on horseback, with the victim on his knees or perhaps even lying on the ground. It's interesting to note that any one of these blows would have been fatal. So we've perhaps got some evidence of overkill here, a frenzied attack.
And what do you know about this victim?
In contrast to what was happening at Crammond, this individual received a very formal and elaborate burial in the cemetery, associated with a circular cairn and a rectangular cairn, described as a dumbbell complex. That's what it looks like. This skeleton's currently undated as well, although further work is going to be carried out on that. Preliminary isotope analysis suggests that this man was not born locally. Indeed, analysis of isotopes at London Links is starting to throw up some really interesting results.
Oh, where were they from?
It looks like we've got quite a diverse population represented, with individuals being local, some coming from the west coast of Scotland and some coming from the Northern Isles.
And what about the Dunbar case study?
4 examples of fatal cranial trauma came from Dunbar. Now, as I said, Dunbar was originally a native stronghold and it became an Anglian centre, almost certainly a royal centre. Again, these discoveries were 19th century. They've been sitting in a museum for over 100 years and had never been looked at. So one of the other things that we're trying to do is look into possible contextual information for these.
What are you doing with those?
We want to get radiocarbon dates, DNA analysis, isotope analysis are all underway.
And how would the Anglian presence be significant?
It's quite tempting to suggest, given that Anglian occupation did take place and it was almost certainly a royal centre, that this violence was happening as a result of increased population density within the town, or perhaps tensions between Anglians and natives living there.
The last location was a bit different, wasn't it?
The final interesting concentration is on the Isle of May, which is located in the Firth of Forth. The Isle of May is a monastic settlement with its origins in the 6th century, if not earlier. Recent research by a colleague has suggested that it may have been a site of pilgrimage that people went to for healing.
And does the evidence reflect that?
One older adult male had a healed injury, an ante-mortem sharp force injury, which I identified during my research. That had not previously been identified in the original osteological report. The injury had bisected the skull at the back and the fragments didn't knit back together, so it was a relatively long-standing injury. There was some degree of healing visible.
Would he have lived long with that?
The location of this injury is interesting because it's quite likely that it would have caused significant visual impairment. Now, combined with the injury, this older chap appeared to be suffering from prostate cancer. So I would suggest that he travelled to the island, to the monastery, perhaps for healing, and he actually died there.
Where did he travel from?
Isotope analysis again suggests that he comes from somewhere else, almost probably the Northern Isles of Scotland. So I like the idea of this old warrior that survived a horrible injury, travelled to the monastery for healing purposes, sadly died. A second adult of interest from the Isle of May is younger. He's in his 20s. He had suffered 2 massive sharp force injuries on the top of the head, probably from a sword again, or it could have been an axe. Again, either would have been fatal. The skull was completely bisected. Unfortunately, his skeleton did not survive. There was a lot of recutting at the Isle of May and disarticulated material, so it's not been possible to identify the postcranial skeleton. How did he get there? Was he killed on the island by monks? Was he transported there after death? If so, why? The isotopes indicate that he was also not local, but further work is being done on trying to identify precise origins.
You're getting a huge amount of information from combining these techniques.
The isotope analysis combined with the DNA analysis and the osteological analysis is really coming together to contribute to data on origins and mobility, as well as confirming osteological sexing of poorly preserved skeletons.
So what's the overall picture of violence that you're putting together now?
Overall, the analysis provided evidence to indicate that interpersonal violence is a predominantly male phenomenon and fatal sharp force trauma is an exclusively male phenomenon. Interpersonal violence also seems to be linked to the fighting age of predominantly male victims. Few women and children appear to be affected. The skeletal evidence tells us that the historical sources, the iconography on carved stones, does seem to reflect the relatively routine and quite high use of violence in early medieval society, obviously with all the caveats linked to the interpretation of the historical sources.
And why this very localised area?
Most of the evidence for fatal violence is occurring in and around the Firth of Forth, and that was the Pictish frontier. So I think the results have important implications for our understanding of the nature of the relationships between Angles, Britons and Picts. A particular historical source of reference was by a Dominion who was an abbot of Iona. Now, he produced a text in the 7th century called the Law of Innocence. It was a legal text which concerned the protection of priests, women and children from violence. He was sufficiently concerned about the safety of these individuals that he produced this text, and he refers to dire mutilations and dismemberments, as well as pillaging and burning of churches and sanctuaries.
Yeah, he was clearly very concerned. So what would you say was the actual scale of violence at this period in southeast Scotland?
I think we can go some way to suggest that in selected situations, the threat of violence was perhaps sufficient to avoid confrontation. The sources refer to payment of compensation for that very purpose. There are references to sieges and destruction by fire. One school of thought, modern school of thought, is quite revisionist regarding the sources and is suggesting that we can't take any of it as true and it all has to be thrown out, if you like. I think the skeletal evidence combined with the other evidence that's been employed in this research points perhaps more to a slightly middle ground in terms of the scale and the type of violence that was happening. So we've not got cowboys and Indians. We've not got a peaceful coexistence, probably somewhere more in the middle with a combination of formalised fighting, surprise attacks, ambushes, massacres and raids.
And how do you assess the success of this approach?
The research has benefited massively from this multidisciplinary approach, which, as I said, involves DNA analysis, isotope analysis, new radiocarbon dating, small pilot study on XRF and SEM analysis. I think it has demonstrated the importance of regional syntheses of skeletal information, while I firmly believe that the skeletal evidence is the basic building block for any study of violence in the past. It can only benefit from such a multidisciplinary approach, and that's certainly an avenue of research that I would recommend for other people in the future. I don't think I can emphasise enough the value of re-examining assemblages using modern techniques where possible. Clearly, there is also huge untapped potential in museum archives as well.
And how will the data be made available? What's the publishing plan?
The research has generated a huge body of skeletal and other data. I focused almost exclusively on the evidence for trauma in the thesis. So I will be looking to attempt comprehensive publication of the skeletal data because, as I said, most of it has not been subjected to, well, in fact, none of it has been subjected to modern forensic analyses of trauma. Some of it's never had any osteological analyses. So in terms of Scottish archaeology and the understanding of the skeletal material, I think it's crucial that this data is made available.
And where does the research go from here?
Logically, I would want to expand the approach that I've applied in the thesis, both spatially and chronologically, to look for variations in levels of violence across Scotland and between different time periods. My plan is to move kind of backwards into the Iron Age and maybe a little bit forwards to take in the period of Viking attacks.
And what about the complementary techniques?
It would also be very profitable to expand the pilot study of XRF and SEM analysis on cut edges because it was a very preliminary study.
Linda Fieberger's had success with sin bone experiments. Have you considered that?
Possibly also some experimental work using sin bone replicas and replica Anglo-Saxon weapons. Although I said that the record for Scotland is poor, it's entirely legitimate to draw on the evidence from further south because of the Anglian occupation. Got lots of collaborative papers planned with a variety of the specialists that have been involved in my research and kind enough to feed into that. So lots of writing ahead.
Thank you so much for joining me, Angela Boyle. I'm turning now to ELINAHLINSUNDMAN of the University of Iceland. Together with Dr. ANDANNAKJELLSTRÖM, Elin recently published a paper in the European Journal of Archaeology on weapon-related trauma and medieval masculinities. Welcome, Elin. We're in the later medieval period now. What do we know about masculinity or masculine ideals?
Well, the field of medieval masculinities has been studied for a few decades now, so there is quite a lot of background information before I started on this research, but then it's mainly using other type of sources, lots of historical sources and also archaeology, but human bone material has not been used that much. But from this earlier research, it is known that there was lots of variation in masculinities in medieval Europe. One particular difference was between lay people and the clergy, that there were different ideals of how to behave and what was considered masculine for different groups of men. And here was an opportunity to look what kind of impact that would have on your body, to analyze these human remains and see if there were traces of violence, physical violence, and if this differed between different groups of men, such as you would expect, considering these different ideals in medieval time.
So it wasn't uniform then, it was different for different people. And what was the relationship with violence?
For lay people, like not members of the church, then it could, of course, also be a lot of variation depending on other circumstances, such as your socioeconomic status or your profession and so on, but also things in common, such as ideals of strength and endurance and power and control. And all these qualities that an ideal man was supposed to possess then had to be put into action in some way, that you enact your masculinity. Using violence could be one such way if it was used in an appropriate manner. So there was socially accepted violence and then other types of violence that were considered criminal or unethical or ways you were not supposed to behave, depending on who you were. For example, if you're a knight, then obviously going to war and fighting for a just cause, perhaps even going on a crusade, would be a very good opportunity to use violence in a good way that showed that you were very masculine. But this could also sort of spill over to other situations outside the battlefield in your daily life, where the violence could be a useful way to express your masculinity and show other people that you were very masculine. This also included generally other groups of men as well. For example, the leader of a household was supposed to chastise his subordinates, his wife, children, other people, not like beating them up really hard, but using a physical violence to just teach them a lesson, to keep them in place. Violence was much more accepted in society then and very much associated with the position of power and with men compared to women. I mean, women could also use violence, but not at all as frequent, it seems, and then not using weapons to such an extent, more perhaps beating your servants or children a bit.
What about chastisement or physical punishment in the clergy?
Well, in the clergy, violence could also be used in a moderate physical violence for disciplining if someone was transgressing the rules, but it should not be used in anger or anything. It should be with a right spirit, with love. You should only use it for a good cause. And of course, this was not always followed by all members of the clergy. I mean, there were bishops going to war and not just leading their troops, but actually arming themselves and participating in battle. There are a lot of documentation on priests and monks and so on who got into fights and sometimes even killed people. So it did happen, but that was not idealized in any way. It was not the way they were supposed to behave. Their ability to show that they were masculine, to show their strength and their bravery, they had to do it in other ways, not using physical violence then, but perhaps show their spiritual strength instead.
So in terms of the archaeology, how have you gone about researching these different types of people?
Okay, I'm looking at two materials. One is from Iceland, from SkeletalAssemblages in eastern Iceland, where you have a Augustinian monastery that was excavated a few years ago. And in the cemetery and church, a lot of burials were excavated. The archaeologist, Steinar Kristiansdottir, she could identify different groups of people who had been buried there. So it's not just members of the Augustinian community, but also a lot of patients, because there was a hospital there and there were benefactors buried there as well. Lay people and servants who were working at this hospital, they were buried at separate areas. So you could detect their different groups, and that make it a good opportunity to compare different groups with one another. So you could look for signs of violence and then compare if you find it in the group of Augustinian canons or in the patients, compare men and women and so on. And that material was very good for that kind of question. The other site that was studied here was a Dominican priory in Västerås in Sweden, which was a much larger material with over 300 individuals analyzed. And here the excavation was already in the 1950s, so the documentation was not very good there, and it's harder to tell who's actually who and who has been buried in which parts of the cemetery and church. But at least by comparing it to other sites, it's likely that you have a separation of the areas there as well. So for example, it would be regarded as more high status burial area to be buried inside the church building, and particularly close to the high altar, compared to being buried out in the cemetery. So here you got a larger material, but you can be less specific about who is actually buried where. But here at least you can compare different groups on the level of men and women, and you can compare higher and lower socioeconomic status in this group.
And what kind of trauma were you able to identify using osteo techniques?
Well, in the analysis, I was looking for signs of physical violence in the skeletons, then trying to separate different types of trauma, and particularly then if it's related to violence or weapons. The hard bit is, of course, to find the cause of the injury. Is it caused by accident, or is it intentional violence behind it? So first, identify different types of injuries. And then we were looking for sharp force trauma, where you can see a cut mark from a sharp weapon, such as a sword. And then blunt force trauma, when there's more of a depression fracture, perhaps a crushing injury. A lot of these injuries in the materials were healed. So then it's harder to tell exactly what it looked like from the start, but you can see rounded edges of some kind of weapon that has been used. Then trying to separate then if this injury was caused by violence or if it was accidental. And that, of course, has to be some sort of estimation, what is the most likely case, because even if you see sort of a blade wound to the head, it's not impossible that this happened by accident. While when you get to other types of injuries, it is quite possible. Say, for example, we included in this study facial fractures, because at least in forensic cases nowadays, facial fractures are often caused by violence. So, for example, a nasal fracture could be caused by someone intentionally trying to hurt this person. But of course, it's also possible that someone is just falling over on their face. But somewhere you have to draw the line. So facial fractures we also included, and blunt force trauma to the head above the hat brim line. But then blunt force trauma to the body, say fractured ribs or fractures to the long bones, we have not included in this study, though they might very well be caused by violence. In individual cases, it's just so hard to tell what the cause is.
So in these two cemeteries, there were men, women, there were clergy and lay people. Were many of them victims of violent trauma?
Yeah, well, first we compared the results in men and women who were most exposed to violence. Of course, you see the victims of violence here, and then you could just assume that in some cases, at least, these are people who are also active in combat and are using violence themselves as well, not merely victims. So you could see that in the Icelandic material, from Skid to the Coaster, the frequencies of injuries caused by violence were pretty similar in men and women, and rather low. So there were just a few people basically, and all except one was also healed injuries. So they must have survived at least for some time for the bone to have time to heal. There was no injuries among the Augustinian canons and not among the lay brothers. All the men who had injuries were patients, so they could have any kind of background basically, but they have come to this hospital at the monastery for treatment, probably not treatment for their wounds as they were already healed. Then in Västerås, there was instead a large difference if you compared men and women, that women were a bit similar to the case in Iceland, that there were a few of them had healed injuries, but not very many, 5% or so. And these were blunt force trauma that had healed. So they had received like a severe blow to the head, enough to cause a fracturing of the bone, but they had survived this and it had healed. Well, in the men, it was nearly 20% had different types of weapon-related injuries, both healed injuries and perimortem injuries where there were no signs of healing or bone remodeling in any way. So they must have died, perhaps caused by this injury or at least shortly after. In 2 cases, you could see the early signs of healing, that the bone is beginning to heal, but not got very far. So they maybe died a few weeks or so after they got this injury. But what was also interesting in Västerås was that it differed between different burial areas. So probably if we assume then that different groups of men were buried in different areas, then we can see that the exposure to violence differed between these different groups of men. And then we particularly looked at those with sharp force trauma, which we could expect to be more common if you were injured in a battle. Like you find in mass burials from battlefields, you have a lot of unhealed sharp force trauma. So looking at who were particularly affected by this kind of injury, we found that one part of the church, the northern section of the church, there this type of injury was particularly frequent, and also the blunt force trauma and the heel trauma was more frequent in this group. So it seems to be the same type or same group of men who had battle experience. Some of them might have been professional warriors who also got involved in violence in other situations and who was using and being exposed to violence in their everyday life much more than other men.
Right, so what did these injuries tell you about later medieval people being violent? What were they doing to each other?
Well, what was very noticeable in this material, particularly from Västerås, was that these smaller but still severe injuries that had healed were so common in certain groups of men that in the northern part of the church, it was even like 30% of the men had some type of weapon-related injury. And you could see a pattern that very much of these injuries were to the forehead, that it seems like there is a certain structure to how you use violence, that there are rules probably on how you do, in what way you fight. And we suggested some situations that this might occur, that perhaps it was some type of training for battle. So they did hit each other, but not with any lethal intent. It was more kind of practicing. Or that it could be some sort of games. You are not hostile, but you still use violence in a more limited way. It seemed like they, facing each other, because the wounds are very rarely at the back of the body or back of the head. Most of them concentrated to the front. And that they seem to be aiming then for not so much the face, but more the forehead. We mentioned as a comparison in the 19th century, when boxing becomes a popular way of settling business, or just display that you are a very masculine man. And then you have a certain pattern of injuries related to that, like a lot of nasal fractures because you're hitting each other in the face. While here you seem to have a different pattern, the type of battle or game or whatever they're doing, that they have a different idea on how to do it. And people are following these rules and they aim for the head, and perhaps they're wearing some kind of protection there, some kind of helmet. But still, in many cases, you get at least a smaller injury from these activities. So there seems to be some sort of rules that people are generally following on how to do this.
And is this where the masculine expression came in?
We interpret this that this is the ideals of masculine behavior and the appropriate use of violence that has a great impact on how people use violence, that they want to do it in a way that they would be regarded with respect, and that people think that they are manly and that they show their strength, but they are not brutal.
Does this open up new strands of inquiry into violence together with masculinity?
I have been working with this material since, and continue particularly with unhealed injuries in Västerås, and looking more in detail how you could relate the performance of masculinity in relation to battle, both warrior masculinities and different types of warriors, and how they were injured in battle, and relate this to ideas of the body as a kind of a physical capital that is very important to be able to perform masculinity in battle, but at the same time is put at risk, that you showing your bravery in battle, you risk of losing this physical capital or your body's ability to fight. And this puts you at a dilemma that just being a warrior might make you injured, so you can't do it anymore. And then you can look at these type of injuries and how people are injured, sometimes killed, sometimes they get better again. You don't know for sure if they are fully recovered or if there are any permanent brain damage perhaps. Then in some cases where you have several injuries, and both healed and unhealed injuries, it's obviously that they were not discouraged by getting severely hurt and have continued their violent lifestyle, and perhaps being professional warriors and not having very many options then on what to do. But the clerical masculinities can also be seen, at least when you're working with burials from monastic settings. So then you see how these men are also very important in this warrior context, that if you have men injured in battle, you also need people who can take care of them and who are treating their injuries, or perhaps in most cases when it was a bit too late for that, at least you get some kind of spiritual care and a decent burial at least, which was of course a concern if you were killed in battle and died of violent and sudden death and not being able to prepare your soul for it.
And how do we come to understand medieval violence among more groups of people?
I mean, it's a very limited material. It's just a few hundred people that have been studied, and out of these, there are only a handful have these unhealed injuries. So I think this sort of shows the potential of this type of study, but there's still a lot to do, and it would be great to be able to look at more varied materials, to look at larger groups of clergy, definitely, because the group in SkeletalAssemblages, the canons there, they are only very few, and in Västerås we didn't even were able to detect who were the Dominican brothers. So looking at more larger materials and then different types of size for this different patterns of injuries in comparing men to women and different groups of men, I think could be very fruitful.
Thank you for taking part today, ELINAHLINSUNDMAN. And thanks again to Linda Fiebiger and Angela Boyle. All the papers we've talked about today are detailed on the website. So that brings us to the end of this episode of Foreign Countries. Join me next time for another conversation.